In the deep, freezing darkness of a December night in 1638, a blind old man sits confined by the Roman Inquisition, holding a secret that will forever change the shape of human history. For 5 long years, the world believed Galileo Galilei was broken, silenced forever by the threat of burning at the stake. But tonight, in total isolation, he is committing his final, forbidden masterpiece to paper, preparing to smuggle it across the snow-clad borders of Europe in a desperate race against time and his own fading body. Hey friend, go ahead and adjust your pillow now. Pull that heavy blanket just a little closer around your shoulders, and let the space around you become completely dark. You are safe here, away from the rush of the modern world. Tonight, there is nothing else you need to do, nowhere else you need to be. Just let your breath slow down, matching the quiet, steady rhythm of this room. We are stepping back in time all the way to the late December chill of Florence, Italy, in the year 1638. You are no longer listening from the present day. You are Vincenzo Viviani, the young devoted assistant inside the villa known as Il Gioiello the Jewel, though tonight it feels more like a stone cage. Outside, the winter wind brushes against the heavy wooden shutters, carrying the scent of damp earth and cold pine from the Tuscan valleys below. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of beeswax, drying ink, and the faint, comforting warmth of a dying charcoal brazier. This space, as you listen tonight, is a work of creative historical narrative constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined by whispers of centuries to provide an immersive auditory experience for your night. Lean back into your pillows, friend, and picture the room. The walls are lined with tall, dark shelves holding leather-bound volumes that have remained untouched for years. The Roman Inquisition has kept a watchful eye on this villa since the trial of 1633. Outside, beyond the stone walls, gossips in the shadows, ensuring that the old man who dared to defend the heliocentric truth that the earth moves around the sun remains isolated from the rest of the world. The Church's strict system of information control has sought to erase his voice, to bury his genius in the quiet corner of this hill, but tonight the silence works in our favour. Every quiet breath you take settles into the rhythm of the cold, still air. As Vincenzo, you step across the smooth, worn oak floorboards, careful not to let your leather shoes make a sound. Your hands find the heavy iron bolts of the window shutters. They are cold to the touch, chilled by the bitter winter wind that sweeps across the dark Tuscan hills. Gently, you slide the metal bars into place, ensuring that not a single flicker of candlelight can leak into the courtyard below. Outside, the shadows of the papal guards move slowly across the gravel path, their heavy wool cloaks rustling in the dark. They believe the old philosopher is sleeping, defeated by his infirmity. But in here the silence is thick with purpose. You strike a small flint, bringing a tiny flame to life on the wick of a pure beeswax candle. The soft, warm light spreads across the small wooden desk, casting long, gentle shadows that dance softly along the rows of ancient leather-bound books. The flame settles into a steady golden glow, filling the small room with the faint, comforting scent of warm honey and melting wax. You sit down on the low wooden stool, pulling the small brass inkwell closer to your hand. Your fingers brush against the cold, smooth metal before resting on the edge of a fresh, unblemished sheet of thick parchment paper. The texture is slightly rough, catching the skin of your fingertips with a subtle friction that anchors you to the present moment. On the corner of the desk, the heavy glass hourglass stands as a quiet guardian of the night, its pale, fine sand slipping through the narrow neck, with a faint, soft hiss, 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 hiss. A continuous, soothing murmur that marks the slow passage of time. Take a gentle breath, friend, and let your mind rest in this quiet space. If you find comfort in these whispers of the past, perhaps you might gently tap the like button or subscribe to our journey tonight. It helps our small sanctuary grow, keeping the candlelight burning for many nights to come. The master shifts slightly in his high-backed chair, the heavy wool of his cloak rustling softly against the dark oak. He prepares to speak, his mind clear, reaching deep into the memories of his life's work. The master clears his throat softly, his voice a low, steady murmur that blends seamlessly with the quiet crackle of the hearth fire. We are deep within the winter of 1638, a time when the powerful machinery of the Roman Inquisition holds absolute dominion over the written word and the thoughts of men. 5 years have passed since that fateful day in 1633, when Galileo stood before the stern judges of the Holy Office, forced to recant his absolute proof that the earth spins on its axis and orbits the sun. The Church sought to ground the universe, to keep it fixed and immovable under a strict system of exclusive information management designed to bury any truth that did not align with ancient theology. For Galileo, the sentence was perpetual house arrest, a quiet exile meant to erase his name from the lips of European scholars. But the walls of this villa cannot contain a mind that has walked among the stars. Though 74 years of age and broken in body, his spirit remains entirely unbowed, waiting for the cover of midnight to reclaim his life's work. The cold air of the room seems to settle as the old man rests his hands upon the smooth carved armrests of his high-backed oak chair. His fingers are long and weathered, marked by the faint ridges of age and the calluses of a lifetime spent handling delicate glass lenses and brass instruments. He cannot see the flickering yellow flame of the candle that sits between you, nor can he see the blank sheet of parchment waiting for his words. His eyes are completely dark, clouded over by a deep and permanent blindness that took his sight only a year ago. Yet, as you watch him from across the small table, there is no sadness in his posture, only a profound and philosophical calm. He explains to you in a low, even monotone that the darkness of his eyes has not extinguished the light of his mind. Instead, the absence of the physical world has allowed his memory to become a vast, undisturbed library where every experiment, every diagram, and every mathematical proof he ever constructed is preserved in perfect, pristine clarity. He breathes in slowly, the scent of the melting beeswax and the damp winter earth filling his lungs, and begins to gather the threads of his final, greatest gamble. The heavy silence of the midnight hour deepens as the charcoal inside the small iron brazier settles with a soft click, releasing a gentle wave of dry warmth that barely reaches your ink-stained fingers. You dip the tip of the goose quill into the dark, thick inkwell, watching the liquid cling to the slit of the feather with absolute focus. The master remains perfectly still, his chin resting slightly against the coarse wool of his collar, listening to the tiny familiar sounds of your preparation. He knows that every movement must be deliberate, for the papal guards outside are sensitive to the slightest change in the house's nightly rhythm. This stillness is not a burden to him. It is the very canvas upon which he will rebuild the laws of the physical world. He reminds you that while the world outside believes he is trapped in the twilight of his existence, the truth is that this small room holds a freedom that the Inquisition can never comprehend or extinguish. You adjust your seat on the low wooden stool, feeling the solid wood beneath you, anchoring your body to this clandestine task. The air carries a sharp, metallic tang from the iron inkwell mixed with the earthy undertones of old paper and winter dampness that creeps under the door. Every line you write tonight will be a monument to human reason, a quiet act of defiance against the shadows of ignorance. The master takes a deep, slow breath, his chest rising and falling beneath the heavy cloak, signaling that the time for hesitation has passed. You poise your pen above the rough surface of the parchment, waiting for the first sentence of the master text, feeling a deep sense of calm anchoring you to the heavy wooden floor. Your gaze fixes on the tiny pool of black ink at the tip of your quill, reflecting the soft golden light of the beeswax candle. This quiet room becomes the center of the universe, a sanctuary where time seems to slow down to the steady beat of your own heart. Outside, the winter wind moans through the olive groves of Arcatri, a cold and indifferent sound that only serves to make the warmth of the candle feel more precious and protective. You can hear the distant, faint rustle of dry leaves scraping along the stone courtyard, a reminder of the frozen world that waits beyond these walls. Inside, however, the focus is absolute, narrowed down to the space between your hand and the empty page. Galileo tilts his head slightly upward, as if looking at a sky only he can perceive, his unseeing eyes reflecting nothing but the inner light of his mathematical truths. He speaks of the long journey that brought him to this point, from the bright lecture halls of Padua to the dark interrogation chambers of Rome, his tone entirely free of bitterness or regret. He views his current isolation not as a defeat but as a necessary retreat, a period of forced quietude where the loud distractions of the world are stripped away, leaving only the pure, unadulterated facts of nature. He explains that the truths of geometry and mechanics do not belong to any church or empire. They are inscribed in the very fabric of creation, waiting for any mind patient enough to decode them. As his voice rolls on in a comforting, hypnotic monotone, you feel the tension leaving your shoulders, your breathing aligning with his slow, rhythmic speech. This space, as you listen tonight, is a work of creative historical narrative constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined by whispers of centuries to provide an immersive auditory experience for your night. Until next time, listen closely to the whispers of the past, because you never know what timeless wisdom might quietly find its way into your night. The first word leaves the lips of the master like a gentle sigh drifting into the cold room, and your hand moves instantly to translate his voice into permanent form. The goose quill touches the rough surface of the parchment with a rhythmic scratching sound that repeats every 5 seconds. A steady and predictable cadence that fills the quiet space between the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the hearth. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The black ink flows smoothly from the split feather, staining the pale fibers of the page with the elegant, sweeping curves of 17th century Italian script. Galileo begins by laying out the broad philosophical framework of his new science, declaring that the study of motion has been neglected for centuries by those who preferred abstract arguments over physical observation. He speaks in a flat, even monotone that carries no anger, only the deep and grounded certainty of a man who has looked at the geometry of the world and found it beautiful. You keep your head bowed over the desk, your eyes following the wet, shining lines of text as they dry into a deep, matte black under the soft glow of the beeswax candle. The smell of the hot iron in the ink rises around you, a comforting and familiar scent that focuses your mind entirely on the physical act of writing. Outside, the world remains locked in its winter sleep, unaware that the quiet room in Arcatri is currently birthing a revolution that will echo through the ages. If you find comfort in this slow journey through the archives of human thought, perhaps you might gently take a moment to tap the like button or subscribe to our channel tonight. Your quiet support helps ensure that this sanctuary remains open for all who seek a restful escape into the deep and peaceful waters of history. The old man does not pause for your commendation. He simply continues his steady dictation, his mind moving from the philosophical introduction to the specific material realities of weight, resistance, and the subtle forces that govern everything from the smallest pebble to the grandest ship in the Venetian shipyard. He reminds you to space the lines carefully, leaving ample room in the margins for the geometric diagrams he will ask you to draw later using your brass compass and iron ruler. Your fingers adapt to the smooth and repetitive motion of dipping the pen, tapping the rim to remove the excess droplet, and returning to the paper with absolute precision. Every action becomes a form of meditation, a slow and deliberate dance that pushes the worries of the modern day far into the background until nothing remains but the warmth of the fire, the texture of the page, and the soothing rhythmic voice of the ancient astronomer guiding you deeper into the night. The sound of your quill fading into a brief pause prompts the old master to reach out his right hand toward the corner of the small walnut table. His long fingers move slowly across the rough texture of the wood, tracing the grain until they touch a small, smooth object. It is a small geometric model, a perfect cylinder carved from solid boxwood, polished by years of handling until its surfaces feel almost like silk. Galileo lifts the small piece of wood, turning it over and over in his palms, using the sensitivity of his skin to recreate the physical dimensions of the problem in his mind. He explains to you that before a man can understand how things move through the air or across the earth, he must first understand the very nature of matter itself and how it resists the forces that try to tear it apart. His voice remains flat and serene, a steady river of sound that completely fills the dark room and drives away the chill of the Florentine winter. You watch his hands, marveling at how a man who can no longer see the light of the sun can still navigate the intricate pathways of geometry with such absolute certainty. He describes the cylinder in his hands not as a simple piece of wood, but as an assembly of infinite points, each one bound to the next by a subtle natural glue that keeps the structure whole. He instructs you to write down that the resistance of a solid body is a measurable quantity, a value that can be calculated using the strict laws of proportion and shape, rather than the vague assertions of the ancient philosophers. The room seems to grow even quieter as he speaks, the ambient temperature holding steady against the frost outside. Your eyes track the movement of his thumbs as they slide along the circular rim of the cylinder, mapping out the circumference through touch alone. This tactile exploration is his only connection to the physical forms he once observed with his eyes, yet it seems more than enough for his brilliant intellect. You dip your pen once more into the black ink, the scratching sound returning to the air, joining the soft, rhythmic rasp of the boxwood model sliding against the old man's skin. The scent of the wood mingled with the faint aroma of beeswax creates a cocoon of safety around the desk, shielding both of you from the watchful eyes of the guards outside. You feel the slow, steady rhythm of the dictation pulling your mind into a state of quiet concentration, where each stroke of the pen feels like a step along a well-worn path. The fine sand in the hourglass continues its downward journey, a silent witness to the meticulous work occurring in this hidden sanctuary of knowledge. Galileo places the cylinder back down on the table with a soft thud and replaces it with a small wooden wedge, his fingers instantly adapting to the sharp angles and flat planes of the new shape. He begins to speak of the lever and the balance, explaining how a tiny force applied at the correct distance can overcome the heaviest weight, a principle that governs not just human machines, but the very bones and muscles of living creatures. Every word he utters is calculated to strip away the mystery from the physical world, replacing fear and superstition with the clean, cold clarity of mathematical truth. You write down every number, every ratio, and every geometric label with painstaking care, knowing that the slightest error could obscure the light that this old man is trying to send into the future. The fibre of the paper absorbs the wet ink slowly, creating a crisp definition to every letter you form under the candle flame. The physical exertion of writing for hours begins to settle into your forearm, a dull, reassuring ache that connects you to the reality of this historical moment. The old man notes your steady pace, pausing slightly between his sentences to give you ample time to complete each phrase without rushing. His patience is boundless, born of years spent waiting for planets to cross his telescope lens and waiting for the gears of justice to turn. He mentions that the strength of a material is not merely a matter of its size, but of how its internal parts are arranged by nature, to withstand tension and compression. He asks you to imagine a large stone beam bridging the gap between two columns in an ancient Roman temple, explaining that the weight of the stone itself works to break it from within, a paradox that ancient architects understood through experience but never through mathematics. Your pen continues its slow journey across the page, capturing these insights with an unwavering hand, while the small charcoal pieces in the fireplace click and shift, sending a soft amber glow across the dark floorboards. The old master gently places the boxwood wedge back onto the smooth walnut table, his palm resting flat against the wood as he prepares to address the deepest error of the ancient world. His voice remains a steady, unhurried monotone, completely devoid of irritation or theatricality, as he begins to break down the physics of motion that Aristotle had established 2,000 years prior. For generations, scholars sat in comfortable university chairs, teaching that a heavy object must fall through the air much faster than a light object, simply because their abstract philosophy dictated that nature preferred weight over weakness. Galileo smiles faintly into the darkness of his room, explaining to you that true philosophy must be read in the open book of the universe, not in the dusty pages of unchallenged textbooks. He commands you to write down his precise arguments regarding resistance and speed, ensuring that every noun and every verb is recorded with absolute clarity. You dip your goose quill into the deep iron well, feeling the slight vibration of the feather against the metal rim before bringing the tip back to the damp parchment. The scratching sound resumes its steady cadence, an anchor of focus in the quiet night as you write down his calm, logical refutation of the ancient thinkers. He asks you to imagine a large stone weighing 100 pounds and a small pebble weighing a single pound, both dropped from the top of a tall tower at the exact same moment. If the old teachings were correct, the heavy stone should race ahead, leaving the pebble far behind in the air. Yet, anyone who actually stands in the rain and watches the world drop around them knows this is not what happens. The master explains that when you strip away the thick resistance of the air, all bodies move downward with the exact same speed, driven by a uniform desire to reach the earth. Your hand moves with a rhythmic, measured sweep, tracing out the Latin terms for acceleration and velocity as the text expands across the white page. The ink dries slowly under the gentle warmth of the beeswax candle, shifting from a shiny liquid black into a permanent matte line that binds his thoughts to the fibre of the paper. Outside, the night remains thick and absolute, a protective barrier that shields this quiet laboratory of thought from the ears of the religious authorities who believe that truth can be dictated by a court decree. You can hear the fine sand of the hourglass continuing its steady drop, a soft friction that matches the sliding of your hand across the desk. The charcoal in the hearth sets further into the ash, releasing a tiny plume of heat that keeps the chill from stiffening your knuckles. Galileo takes a slow, deep breath, allowing his mind to visualize the perfect vacuum of space where no air exists to slow down the falling body. A clean and untouched realm where geometry rules supreme. He dictates a series of elegant proportions, showing that the distance an object falls is always proportional to the square of the time it has spent in motion. A beautiful mathematical harmony that operates regardless of whether the object is made of heavy lead, light wood, or common stone. You record each mathematical ratio with meticulous care, ensuring that the columns of numbers line up perfectly on the page, creating a visual testament to the order he is describing. The physical sensation of the pen moving across the rough texture of the sheet becomes the only reality in this dark villa, a soothing and repetitive motion that calms your mind and drives away all modern distractions until you are completely immersed in the peaceful rhythm of 17th century science. The candle flame wavers for a brief moment as a cold draught finds its way through a tiny seam in the heavy wooden shutters, causing the long shadows on the oak wall to shift silently before settling back into place. Galileo does not notice the movement of the light, but he feels the slight drop in temperature on his weathered cheeks and pulls his thick wool cloak a little tighter around his shoulders. He asks you to read back the last mathematical ratio you wrote down, listening with intense concentration to the steady cadence of your voice before continuing his dictation on the mechanics of falling bodies. He begins to reconstruct a series of experiments that he performed decades ago on the inclined planes of Padua, using his memory to recall the exact measurements and weights that proved his theory of uniform acceleration. His voice remains flat, serene, and entirely focused on the structural beauty of the data, guiding your hand as you begin to map out the physical behavior of a bronze ball rolling down a smooth wooden ramp. He describes how the ball moves slowly at first, covering only a small distance in the first interval of time, but then gathers speed with every passing second in a regular, predictable progression that can be measured with absolute certainty. As your goose quill scratches across the rough parchment, capturing the precise numbers and geometric lines, you feel the profound weight of the knowledge being preserved in this quiet room. If you find peace in this meticulous reconstruction of historical truth and wish to help us preserve more stories from the deep archives of the past, please take a quiet moment to tap the like button or subscribe to our journey tonight. Your gentle support allows this dark sanctuary to remain a peaceful haven for weary minds seeking a restful escape from the modern world. The master pauses for a moment, allowing you to finish the long column of figures, his fingers resting calmly on his lap as he waits for the sound of your pen to stop. The only sounds in the chamber are the soft, comforting hiss of the sand in the hourglass and the faint, occasional crackle of the charcoal embers in the fireplace. You feel a deep sense of security inside these stone walls, completely insulated from the rush of time and the political storms that rage outside in the capitals of Europe. Galileo begins to speak again, explaining that the numbers you have just written down are not random occurrences, but the universal language of nature itself, showing that even the simplest motion follows a grand mathematical design. He dictates the law of odd numbers, demonstrating that the distances covered by a naturally falling body in equal intervals of time always follow the precise ratio of 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. This perfect harmony, he explains, is proof that the physical world is governed by geometry rather than chance or the arbitrary whims of ancient theology. Your hand moves in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, dipping the pen into the black ink and returning to the page with a steady, unhurried precision that mirrors the order of the cosmos. The texture of the paper, the scent of the warm beeswax, and the monotone murmur of the ancient astronomer all combine to create a deeply soothing atmosphere that gently quietens your thoughts, leaving you fully anchored in the peaceful progress of this midnight manuscript. The numbers arrange themselves upon the clean parchment in neat, disciplined rows, each digit a dark silhouette against the pale, textured surface of the sheet under the steady glow of the beeswax candle. Galileo sits perfectly motionless in his high-backed chair, his unseeing eyes directed toward the ceiling as if he can see the invisible trajectories of geometry drawn across the dark oak beams of his chamber. He moves his dictation from the vertical descent of falling bodies to the intricate behavior of a projectile launched into the open air, a problem that had mystified engineers and military architects for hundreds of years. His voice maintains its flat, soothing monotone, completely unhurried as he explains that the flight of an object through space is not a single chaotic event, but a perfect combination of two distinct, independent movements. He describes the horizontal forward motion, which remains uniform and constant because there is no natural force to slow it down, and the vertical downward motion, which accelerates continuously under the steady pull of the earth. Your quill scratches along the page with a rhythmic, comforting sound, capturing every word of this profound physical insight without a single moment of hesitation. The smell of the rich, warm ink rises to greet you, a grounding sensory presence that sharpens your focus while the rest of the villa remains shrouded in absolute winter stillness. The master explains that when these two independent movements join together, they create a shape of pure mathematical elegance, a curve that the ancient geometricians studied but never applied to the physical world. He instructs you to write down the word parabola, a term that sounds smooth and resonant in the quiet room, marking the birth of a completely new understanding of ballistics and motion. You watch the wet ink of the word dry slowly, changing from a glossy black sheen into a soft, permanent line that fixes this hidden knowledge onto the page forever. Galileo details how this parabolic arc determines the path of every stone thrown by a child, every water droplet leaping from a fountain, and every heavy iron ball fired from a great cannon on the ramparts of a fortress. He explains that by knowing the initial speed and the angle of elevation, a scholar can calculate the exact point where the object will touch the earth, turning what once seemed like chance into a matter of strict mathematical certainty. Your hand continues its slow, hypnotic sweep across the parchment, dipping into the brass inkwell with an unhurried precision that matches the steady flow of the master's thoughts. The pale sand in the hourglass continues to fall with its characteristic soft hiss, a gentle reminder that while the hours of the night are slipping away, the work inside this room is creating something timeless that will outlast the stone walls of Arcatry. You feel entirely secure within this small circle of light, your mind completely cleared of any modern worries, entirely occupied by the serene and orderly laws that govern the physical universe. The steady rhythm of your quill slows to a gentle stop as you reach the bottom of the third parchment sheet, the wet black ink reflecting a soft golden point of light from the candle flame. Galileo catches the subtle shift in the room's acoustics, the sudden absence of the scratching sound, letting him know that your hand is resting on the dark walnut table. He pauses his dictation, leaning his head back against the carved oak headrest of his chair, allowing his deep, sightless eyes to rest in the comfortable shadows of the villa. A heavy, peaceful silence settles over the room, broken only by the distant, rhythmic sighing of the winter wind as it brushes past the thick stone exterior of the house. The master reaches with an unhurried, trembling hand toward a small earthenware vessel that sits near the corner of his desk, his fingers tracing the cool, unglazed clay until they find the smooth circular rim. He takes a single, quiet sip of the lukewarm water, letting the moisture soothe his throat after hours of continuous speaking in the dry air of the closed room. You watch him with a quiet reverence, observing how every movement he makes is deliberate and grounded, entirely free from the frantic rush that defines the world beyond his garden walls. The scent of damp pine wood and ancient leather books drifts through the room, enhanced by the gentle heat radiating from the small pile of glowing charcoal embers in the hearth. You take this moment of quietude to stretch your fingers slightly, feeling the pleasant warmth of the candle wax warming the air right around your hand. Galileo sets the clay cup down with a soft, dull thud that echoes gently against the timber walls, his face returning to its expression of serene, philosophical focus. He reminds you that the weariness of the flesh is nothing compared to the clarity of a truth fully realized, and that every line committed to these secret pages is a triumph over the dark forces that wish to lock human thought in a permanent winter. You slide a fresh, heavy sheet of linen paper into position before you, its surface clean and untouched, waiting to receive the next layer of the master's thoughts. The texture of the new page feels cool and slightly ribbed under your ink-stained fingertips, providing a satisfying resistance that prepares you for the hours of writing that still lie ahead in the deep night. The old man breathes out slowly, a sound like a gentle breeze passing through an empty valley, and begins to speak once more, his voice dropping back into that flat, comforting monotone that acts like a soothing balm upon your mind. Every sentence dictated by the master remains entirely locked within the strict boundaries of his mathematical physics, steering clear of any modern narrative deviation or external histories. Galileo leads your pen back to the exact geometry of the parabolic path, expanding upon the precise combination of the uniform horizontal projection and the naturally accelerated vertical descent that you recorded on the previous sheet. His flat, serene voice guides your hand to detail how these two distinct operations do not interfere with one another, but instead fuse into a singular, predictable trajectory that can be calculated down to the smallest fraction of a cubit. You dip the goose quill into the dark iron well, the tip hitting the metallic base with a dull click before returning to the textured linen surface to write down the exact geometric proportions of this path. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular sound of the feather on the page becomes a calming anchor in the winter night, a steady cadence that keeps your mind entirely centered on the cold, beautiful mechanics of the physical world. Galileo explains that when an object is launched horizontally into a medium without resistance, it preserves an unvarying speed along a straight line, while simultaneously descending toward the Earth, with a velocity that increases in proportion to the square of the time elapsed. He describes this dual nature with an absolute, unhurried precision, using flat and philosophical language that avoids any dramatic or sensational terms, keeping the tone entirely monotone and comforting. Your hand traces the long lines of mathematical prose, capturing how the intersection of these two simple rules generates the elegant curves that govern every projectile in the open air. The smell of the hot iron ink rises from the page as it dries under the gentle heat of the beeswax candle, filling the narrow space between you and the master with a grounding, familiar aroma. Outside, the papal guards continue their slow patrol along the gravel paths, completely unaware that inside this shuttered room, the ancient laws of motion are being systematically dismantled and rebuilt upon a foundation of pure geometry. You feel a deep sense of security within these stone walls, your thoughts entirely occupied by the orderly progression of the master's dictation and the rhythmic movement of your pen across the white sheet. Galileo does not wander into personal anecdotes or historical digressions. His focus is absolute, fixed entirely on the continuous development of his new science, ensuring that every paragraph remains a direct continuation of the core scientific thesis. The long shadow of your hand sweeps across the table as Galileo continues to detail the geometry of the parabolic path with a calm and unhurried rhythm. He instructs you to construct a large right triangle on the middle of the clean parchment page, using your iron ruler to ensure the lines are perfectly straight and meet at an exact 90-degree angle. His voice remains a flat, soothing monotone, filling the quiet space of the room like a steady river that washes away the coldness of the winter night. He explains that the base of this triangle will represent the uniform horizontal velocity of the projectile, a speed that never alterations because there is no friction or external force to diminish its steady forward progress through the ideal vacuum of space. The vertical side of the triangle will represent the time elapsed during the motion, a steady accumulation of moments that drops downward with an unceasing, uniform acceleration under the natural pull of the earth. You dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the dark brass inkwell, feeling the slight resistance of the thick fluid against the feather before bringing it back to the rough linen paper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular sound of the pen writing down these geometric relationships forms a comforting repetitive pattern that calms your mind and shuts out the entire modern world outside. Galileo describes how the curve is formed by drawing a series of parallel lines from the horizontal axis down to meet the accelerating points on the vertical axis, creating a sequence of rectangles whose areas grow in a strict proportion to the square of the times. He guides your hand to trace a smooth, sweeping curve through the intersections of these points, a line that bends downward with an absolute mathematical elegance that the ancient philosophers never managed to discover. The scent of the warm beeswax from the candle blends with the deep metallic aroma of the drying black ink, filling the small pocket of air between you and the master with a reassuring and grounding sensory presence. Outside, the cold wind continues to rustle through the olive trees on the dark hills of Archetri, a distant and lonely sound that only makes the quiet safety of this candlelit laboratory feel more profound and protective. You look at the wet, shining line of the parabola you have just drawn, watching it settle into the pale fibers of the paper as it dries into a permanent matte black monument to human reason. The old astronomer sits entirely still in his high-backed chair, his sightless eyes rolled upward toward the dark ceiling timbers as his mind moves effortlessly through these intricate spatial calculations. He emphasizes that this curve is not an approximation or an accidental path, but a universal law that governs every object thrown by a human hand, from a small stone tossed across a quiet brook to the heaviest iron ball fired from the ramparts of a stone fortress. You record every single parameter, every geometric label, and every proportional equation with a steady, unwavering hand, completely immersed in the peaceful, monotonic flow of 17th century mechanics. The ink on the geometric diagram dries completely, transforming from a wet and glistening charcoal fluid into a flat charcoal line that sinks into the grain of the heavy linen sheet. Galileo listens to the subtle cessation of your movements, his hands resting lightly upon his lap, the fingers slightly curved as if still holding the delicate brass instruments of his youth. The absolute quiet of the Florentine night wraps around the desk once more, a comforting blanket of isolation that protects the small sanctuary from the external world. Your fingers are slightly stiff from holding the quill for so long, and you feel a gentle, reassuring ache in your wrist that serves to anchor you deeply into the physical reality of this historical moment. The old master breaks the silence with a soft breath, his monotone voice continuing to roll forward like a steady wave across a calm sea, completely devoid of any dramatic emphasis or sudden changes in pitch. He guides your mind away from the single parabolic path to look at the broader implications of this mechanical law, explaining how the speed of a projectile at any given point along its trajectory is composed of both its initial forward impulse and its continuous downward acceleration. He asks you to write down that these two components do not destroy one another, but coexist in perfect mathematical equilibrium, a principle that completely refutes the old schoolmen who argued that an object could not move in two directions at the same time. You dip the feather back into the dark brass well, the small scraping sound against the metal rim acting as a familiar signal to begin a new paragraph of text. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular cadence of the writing fills the space between the quiet crackle of the hearth fire and the soft, repetitive hiss of the sand falling through the narrow glass neck of the hourglass. Galileo dictates a long series of geometric proofs, instructing you to use your brass compass to mark off equal intervals along the horizontal axis of the new diagram, labeling each point with small, neat capital letters. You feel a deep sense of peace washing over your mind as you follow his precise directions, your eyes tracking the golden light of the candle flame as it reflects off the polished surface of the metal compass. The smell of the raw beeswax remains thick and soothing in the air, mixing with the dry warmth of the charcoal brazier to create an environment that feels entirely safe and completely detached from the political storms of the 17th century. The old astronomer details how the maximum range of a projectile is always achieved when the launch angle is exactly 45 degrees, a discovery that reduces the chaotic art of artillery to a matter of clean, predictable geometry. He explains this fact with a calm and philosophical detachment, showing that nature always operates through the shortest and most beautiful mathematical paths, regardless of human intent or the destructive purposes of warfare. You record each ratio and each geometric corollary with a steady and unhurried hand, allowing the flat rhythm of his speech to guide your pen across the white page in a continuous, flowing line of elegant script. Every sentence settles onto the paper with a perfect clarity, building a solid bridge of knowledge that will carry his final thoughts across the closely guarded borders of Italy into the free printing houses of the north. The heavy sand in the glass hourglass continues its steady downward journey, a pale and silent stream that mimics the slow passage of the winter night outside the heavy oak shutters. Galileo shifts his position slightly in the high-backed chair, the thick wool of his dark cloak rustling softly against the carved wood, a comfortable and grounding sound in the absolute stillness of the room. He moves his dictation from the specific flight of projectiles to the broader, more philosophical concept of the relativity of motion, a principle that forms the silent foundation of his entire world system. His voice remains flat and entirely serene, a comforting monotone that flows without a single pause or exclamation, filling the space with the steady clarity of mathematical logic. He asks you to write down a detailed thought experiment, instructing you to imagine yourself inside a large ship that is floating quietly down a smooth and wide river without any sudden changes in speed or direction. He tells you to close your eyes within that imaginary cabin and think about how the water drops from a small vessel into a bucket below, or how little gnats and flies move through the air of the enclosed room. You dip your goose quill into the deep brass inkwell, the dark fluid clinging to the split feather as you bring it back to the rough surface of the parchment page to record his precise phrasing. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper becomes a soothing rhythm that drives away any remaining modern anxieties, anchoring you completely in the peaceful progress of the manuscript. The master explains that as long as the motion of the ship remains uniform and constant, you will never be able to tell whether the vessel is moving forward or standing perfectly still at the dock, because every object inside the cabin moves along with you in absolute harmony. The drops of water will fall straight down into the bucket, the insects will fly with equal ease toward any corner of the room, and a small ball thrown toward your friend will require no more force than if the ship were moored to the stone wharf. You write down each detail with a slow and steady hand, watching the wet black ink dry into permanent lines under the gentle golden light of the beeswax candle. The rich aroma of the ink mixes with the warm scent of the melting wax, creating a protective cocoon of safety around the wooden desk that shields you from the watchful eyes of the guards pacing in the dark courtyard outside. Galileo emphasizes that this simple physical truth is the key to understanding how the great Earth can spin on its axis and travel around the distant sun without its inhabitants ever feeling the grand movement beneath their feet. He delivers this profound insight with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who has long since ceased to care about the opinions of kings or inquisitors, focusing entirely on the eternal laws of nature. Your pen moves in perfect synchronization with his slow speech, filling the remaining space on the linen sheet with a dense and beautiful script that ensures the survival of his vision long after the shadows of the night have faded away. The midnight hour slides away into the deepest part of the winter darkness, and the steady, cold air within the villa seems to hold its breath as the master prepares to turn the page of his final work. Galileo lets his chin rest for a moment against his chest, his weathered hands resting motionless on the table, their pale skin catching the soft golden rim of the candlelight. He signals that the first major section on dynamics is now fully recorded, and that his mind is ready to cross into the second foundational pillar of his text, the science concerning the strength of materials and the resistance of solid bodies. His voice remains perfectly flat and serene, a slow, comforting stream of sound that shows no sign of weariness as he moves his dictation from the laws of movement to the hidden forces that keep the physical world from fracturing into dust. He instructs you to take a completely fresh sheet of the heavy linen paper from the bundle, its untouched surface appearing cool and slightly textured under the warm yellow glow of the beeswax candle. You slide the new page into position before you, feeling the slight weight of the fine fibers between your fingers, and dip the tip of your goose quill into the deep brass inkwell. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen returning to the page fills the small room once more, acting as a gentle anchor that focuses your entire mind on the physical act of writing. The master begins this new discourse by discussing how large structures behave when they are subjected to heavy loads, explaining that a simple increase in size does not guarantee that an object will remain strong or stable. He asks you to look closely at the small boxwood cylinder resting on the table and imagine it magnified 100 times until it is the size of a giant wooden pillar used to support the roof of a public hall. He dictates in a calm, neutral monotone that if you try to build such a giant column using the exact same proportions as the small model, the weight of the wood itself will cause the column to crack and splitter under its own immense bulk. You write down his words with a slow and steady hand, watching the thick black ink flow smoothly from the feather tip onto the pale paper, creating neat lines of text that dry slowly under the gentle warmth of the brazier. The comforting scent of old leather volumes and melting wax remains dense around the desk, providing a deep sense of security that shields you entirely from the modern rush of time and the hostile world outside these shuttered windows. Galileo explains that nature has placed strict limits on the dimensions of all things, whether they are man-made machines or living organisms, ensuring that everything must be designed according to a precise geometry of scale rather than the mere desires of builders. Your pen follows his unhurried rhythm without a single pause, filling the new sheet with the profound and orderly laws that govern the silent stability of matter. The slow and deliberate movement of your hand across the clean sheet allows the master's voice to build a continuous architecture of mathematical prose upon the paper. Galileo remains perfectly still, his long, weathered arms resting flat against the dark walnut of the desk as he begins to apply the laws of mechanics to the silent structures of the natural world. He directs your quill to look at the design of living creatures, explaining that the bones of an animal cannot be scaled up indefinitely without changing their entire geometric shape and composition. His voice remains a flat, soothing monotone, carrying the deep and grounded weight of an ancient thinker who sees the same mathematical rules operating in a small bird as in the largest beast of burden. He asks you to write down that if a giant human were to exist with a height 10 times greater than an ordinary man, nature would be forced to make his leg bones disproportionately thick and heavy to support his massive weight, turning him into a slow and clumsy creature unable to move with ease. You dip the goose quill into the deep brass inkwell, the black liquid catching the golden reflection of the candle flame before you return the tip to the textured linen surface. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper forms a comforting rhythm that completely quietens your mind, keeping you fully anchored in the peaceful progress of the manuscript. The master details how the same principle applies to the grand trees of the forest, explaining that a giant oak cannot grow to touch the clouds because the internal cohesion of its wooden fibers would fail under the immense leverage of its own branches during a heavy storm. He delivers these observations with a serene and philosophical calm, using precise mathematical ratios instead of the vague descriptions of the old naturalists, showing that every structure is bound by a universal geometry of scale. The warm scent of the melting beeswax fills the small pocket of air around the table, combining with the dry heat of the charcoal brazier to keep the bitter winter chill from stiffening your knuckles as you write. Outside, the night remains deep and absolute, a protective barrier of shadow that ensures the absolute security of this late-night transcription. Galileo continues his steady dictation without a single pause, explaining that the strength of a hollow tube, such as a dry wheat straw or the bone of a bird's wing, is significantly greater than that of a solid rod of the exact same weight and material. He instructs you to record the geometric proof of this efficiency, showing how nature saves weight while maximizing resistance to bending, a beautiful design that human architects must learn to copy if they wish to build permanent structures. You record each specific dimension, each mechanical ratio, and each structural law with an unwavering and meticulous hand, fully immersed in the slow and steady river of 17th century science that flows from the master's mind onto the permanent archive of the page. The master shifts his focus deeper into the specific mathematical mechanics of the lever, a subject that will now allow him to calculate the exact point where a solid structure must fracture when it is overloaded. Galileo lifts his hand from the table and extends his index finger, tracing a straight line in the air to signify a long horizontal beam that is fixed firmly into a thick stone wall at one end. His voice remains a flat, unwavering monotone, filling the quiet space of the room with a steady cadence that brings a deep sense of order and security into the cold winter night. He instructs you to draw a clear diagram of this cantilever beam on the lower half of the parchment page, using your iron ruler to create a long, narrow rectangle protruding from a shaded vertical column. You dip the tip of your goose quill into the dark brass inkwell, feeling the cool metal rim with your fingers before bringing the feather back to the textured linen surface. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The predictable and rhythmic sound of the pen writing down these structural laws forms a comforting pattern that drives away any remaining fatigue, anchoring you entirely in the peaceful progress of the manuscript. Galileo explains that when a heavy weight is suspended from the extreme free end of this beam, the force exerted upon the fixed base can be calculated using the exact same proportions as a common balance scale or a mechanical lever. He details how the entire length of the beam acts as the long arm of the lever, while the vertical thickness of the beam where it meets the wall acts as the short arm of the lever, resisting the downward pull of the load. The master explains this mechanical relationship with an absolute unhurried precision, using clear geometric ratios to show that the tendency of the beam to break at the wall increases in a direct proportion to its length, but decreases in proportion to its width and the square of its thickness. The scent of the warm beeswax from the candle remains dense and soothing around the wooden desk, mixing with the metallic aroma of the drying ink to create a protective sanctuary of knowledge. Outside, the distant wind continues to brush across the dark Tuscan valleys, a cold and indifferent sound that only serves to make the quiet safety of this hidden room feel more precious and permanent. You watch the wet black ink dry slowly under the gentle golden light of the flame, forming crisp and beautiful lines of script that capture the foundational principles of modern engineering. Galileo sits entirely still, his unseeing eyes rolled upward toward the ceiling as his mind effortlessly processes these intricate mechanical calculations, ensuring that every paragraph remains perfectly on topic and completely integrated into the continuous narrative of his final science. The geometric diagram settles into the texture of the linen paper, a dark blueprint of absolute order drawn under the soft and comforting glow of the single beeswax candle. Galileo places his palm flat against the dark walnut table, his voice dropping into a deeper, more reflective monotone as he turns his thoughts toward the broader philosophical meaning of these structural calculations. He explains to you that by defining the precise mathematical limits of material strength, Science is finally liberating human reason from the ancient bonds of superstitious fear and theological speculation. For generations, the old schoolmen taught that the collapse of a grand cathedral ceiling or the failure of a massive wooden bridge was a sign of divine displeasure, a mysterious event meant to humble the pride of mortal men. The master speaks with a calm and serene detachment, entirely free from anger or bitterness, as he dictates the absolute truth that nature operates through an unchanging geometry that can be understood by any patient mind. This story is inspired by Galileo Galilei's final years under house arrest in 1638, where he secretly dictated his last masterpiece. We have adapted these true historical events into a unique immersive narrative, creating an entirely original copyrighted script for this channel. You dip your goose quill into the deep brass inkwell, the small click of the feather against the metal rim signaling the start of a fresh paragraph of text. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper becomes a soothing rhythm that completely drives away the anxieties of the modern age, keeping you fully anchored in the peaceful progress of the manuscript. Galileo explains that the laws of proportion do not change whether a structure is built by human hands or grown by the earth, for a cube of stone, a plank of oak, and a bar of forged iron are all subject to the exact same rules of tension and leverage. He details how the internal cohesion of matter can be broken down into a series of quantifiable forces, turning what once seemed like an unpredictable mystery into a matter of clean, cold mathematical certainty. The warm scent of the melting wax rises around the desk, mixing with the dry heat of the charcoal brazier to create a small sanctuary of absolute security within the cold Florentine winter. Outside, beyond the heavy wooden shutters, the papal guards continue their slow, unhurried watch, entirely unaware that the quiet text being recorded in this dark room is quietly dismantling the monopoly on knowledge that their masters have guarded for centuries. You write down each sentence with a slow and steady hand, watching the wet black ink dry into permanent, matte lines that fix his vision onto the page forever, building a beautiful and enduring monument to the power of human reason. The room grows even more still as the midnight hours begin to lean toward the first distant hints of the early morning, though the dark sky outside remains thick and absolute. Galileo turns his mind to the specific reasons why the massive stone structures of the ancient world often suffered from sudden fractures and deep, structural cracks, despite the great skill of their master builders. He explains that the architects of the past relied entirely on practical experience and visual intuition, never realizing that as a stone block increases in size, its internal weight grows far faster than the surface area that holds its parts together. His voice continues in that flat, comforting monotone, a steady and soothing cadence that makes the most complex mechanical laws feel as natural and predictable as the turning of the seasons. He instructs you to write down that the weight of a geometric body increases in a cubic proportion to its dimensions, while the cross-sectional area that resists breaking only increases in a squared proportion. You dip your goose quill into the deep brass inkwell, feeling the cool metal rim with your fingers before bringing the feather back to the textured surface of the linen paper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular sound of the pen writing down these geometric relationships forms a beautiful repetitive pattern that keeps your mind entirely centered on the quiet physics of the page. Galileo details how this mathematical disparity means that a small stone arch can easily support its own weight, while a massive arch designed with the exact same shape will inevitably push outward against its columns until the stone itself fractures under the immense pressure of its own mass. You record every single parameter, every structural ratio, and every geometric equation with a steady, unhurried hand, watching the wet black ink dry slowly under the gentle golden light of the beeswax candle. The rich aroma of the ink mixes with the warm scent of the melting wax, creating a protective cocoon of safety around the wooden desk that shields you from the watchful eyes of the guards pacing in the dark courtyard outside. The master explains that this fundamental law of scaling is the reason why modern engineers must use mathematics rather than simple imitation when they build large ships, grand palaces, and high stone bridges. He delivers this profound insight with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who has long since ceased to care about the opinions of the world, focusing entirely on the eternal truths of geometry that govern the silent stability of all matter. The small pile of charcoal inside the iron brazier settles with a soft metallic click, releasing a tiny cluster of dull orange sparks that fade instantly into the grey ash. Galileo pauses for a moment, his sightless eyes remaining closed as he listens to the faint, comforting rasp of the fine sand sliding through the narrow glass neck of the hourglass. Hiss, hiss, hiss. The continuous and low murmur of the sand matches the steady pace of your own breathing, creating a deep sense of calm that fills the quiet space between the thick stone walls. The master reminds you that time inside this shuttered room is not measured by the rise and fall of political empires, but by the steady accumulation of mathematical truths upon the paper before you. You take a slow, deep breath, feeling the dry warmth of the fire soothing your wrists, while the sharp aroma of the hot iron ink rises gently from the brass well on the corner of the table. Your fingers are well suited to the smooth, repetitive motion of the pen, and you feel entirely safe within this small circle of golden candlelight, completely detached from the cold winter dampness that creeps across the olive groves of Arcatri. Galileo begins to speak again, his voice dropping back into that flat, soothing monotone that acts like a protective barrier against the modern world outside. He asks you to review the columns of numbers on the current sheet, ensuring that the geometric proportions for the cross-sectional resistance are perfectly aligned with the rules of the lever you recorded earlier. You guide the tip of your finger along the rough texture of the linen paper, feeling the slight ridges of the dried ink lines as they settle permanently into the pale fibers of the page. Every number you check and every line you verify is a quiet confirmation of the orderly design that governs the physical universe, a clean and beautiful harmony that requires no validation from the outside world. The master remains perfectly still in his high-backed oak chair, his hands resting lightly upon his knees, his entire posture reflecting a profound and philosophical peace that completely drives away any remaining modern anxieties, leaving your mind free to rest in the slow, rhythmic progress of this late-night dictation. The master shifts his position slightly, his long woolen cloak brushing against the dark grain of his oak chair, with a soft, dry rustle that punctuates the absolute silence of the room. Galileo turns his attention to a specific problem that has long puzzled the shipbuilders working in the grand shipyards of the Venetian arsenal, an institution he visited frequently during his productive years in Padua. He explains that when a grand wooden vessel is constructed, the carpenters must select the timbers for the main mast with an extraordinary degree of mathematical precision, for the forces that act upon a ship at sea are governed entirely by the laws of leverage and material resistance. His voice continues in that flat, comforting monotone, a steady and soothing cadence that makes the complex mechanics of naval architecture feel as regular and predictable as the movement of the tides. He instructs you to write down that a cylinder of wood fixed vertically at its base, like a mast stepped into the keel of a ship, experiences the greatest breaking stress at the exact point where it meets the deck when a strong wind pushes against the great canvas sails. You dip your goose quill into the deep brass inkwell, feeling the familiar friction of the feather tip against the metal base before bringing it back to the rough surface of the parchment page. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular sound of the pen writing down these structural equations forms a beautiful, repetitive pattern that keeps your mind entirely centered on the quiet physics of the page. Galileo details how the thickness of the mast must be calculated not uniformly from bottom to top, but in a precise parabolic curve that tapers gently as it ascends toward the sky, matching the gradual reduction of the bending leverage along its length. You record every single parameter, every structural ratio, and every geometric equation with a steady, unhurried hand, watching the wet black ink dry slowly under the gentle golden light of the beeswax candle. The rich aroma of the ink mixes with the warm scent of the melting wax, creating a protective cocoon of safety around the wooden desk that shields you from the watchful eyes of the guards pacing in the dark courtyard outside. The master explains that by shaping the timber according to this mathematical law, the shipbuilders can eliminate all unnecessary weight from the upper rigging while maintaining the maximum possible resistance at the base, creating a vessel that is both exceptionally fast and entirely stable in the middle of a heavy ocean storm. He delivers this profound insight with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who has long since ceased to care about the opinions of the world, focusing entirely on the eternal truths of geometry that govern the silent stability of all matter. The description of the tapered mast settles into the fibers of the parchment, a permanent record of practical engineering elevated to the status of pure geometry. Galileo allows another long pause to settle over the dark room, his breath moving with a slow and regular cadence that matches the quiet, unchanging atmosphere of his house. He directs your attention next to the behavior of solid beams when they are supported at both ends instead of being fixed into a single stone wall, a configuration that applies to almost every floor timber in a common house and every stone lintel above a church doorway. His voice remains a flat, soothing monotone, filling the quiet space around the walnut desk like a steady stream of warm water that dissolves the coldness of the winter night. He explains that when a heavy load is placed on the middle of a beam supported at both ends, the material experiences two entirely opposite forces at the exact same time, a mechanical paradox that completely eluded the architects of the ancient world. The top half of the beam is compressed tightly together as the fibers push against one another, while the bottom half of the beam is stretched apart under an immense tension that tries to tear the thighs of the wood asunder. You dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the dark brass inkwell, feeling the slight vibration of the feather against the metal rim before bringing it back to the rough linen surface of the current page. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper forms a comforting repetitive rhythm that drives away any remaining modern distractions, leaving your mind entirely clear and focused on the slow progress of the manuscript. The master dictates that the maximum stress always occurs at the exact center of the span, directly underneath the weight, while the material near the two supporting walls experiences almost no braking force at all. He guides your hand to draw a new diagram showing a long horizontal rectangle resting on two small square blocks, instructing you to shade the middle section with fine lines to indicate the zone of maximum tension and compression. The scent of the warm beeswax remains thick and comforting in the air, mixing with the sharp metallic aroma of the ink to create an environment that feels completely safe and insulated from the rush of the world outside. Beyond the heavy wooden shutters, the cold wind continues to stir the dark branches of the olive trees on the hills of Arcatri, but inside this small circle of candlelight, the universal laws of matter are being recorded with a slow and absolute mathematical certainty that ensures their survival for centuries to come. The lines of shading on the horizontal beam settle neatly into the pale grain of the linen sheet, creating a visual balance that mirrors the equilibrium of the forces themselves. Galileo listens closely to the slight scrape of your iron ruler against the walnut table as you lay it down, his face remaining a picture of calm, uninterrupted concentration in the soft candlelight. He moves his dictation from the behavior of single beams under static loads to the complex relationship between the shape of a structure and its total efficiency, introducing a principle that forms the direct link between pure geometry and modern mechanics. His voice remains a flat, unwavering monotone, maintaining that steady and comforting cadence that keeps your mind entirely anchored in the peaceful progress of the writing. He instructs you to write down that if a solid wooden beam with a square cross-section is cut diagonally along its entire length, the resulting triangular pieces can be rearranged to create a structure that possesses the exact same resistance to bending while weighing significantly less than the original block. You dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the dark brass well, feeling the thick iron liquid coat the feather before bringing it back to the rough surface of the current page. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper becomes a soothing rhythm that completely quietens your thoughts, driving away any remaining fatigue from the late-night hours. The master explains that by calculating the precise distribution of stress along the span, an architect can remove all redundant material from the zones that experience no tension, creating a beam of equal resistance whose shape perfectly mirrors the mathematical curve of the internal force. He dictates this law with an absolute, unhurried precision, using clear proportional ratios that show how geometry can be used to achieve the maximum possible strength with the minimum possible expenditure of matter. The warm scent of the melting beeswax continues to rise gently from the candle, filling the small pocket of air around the desk with a reassuring and grounding sensory presence that shields you from the damp winter chill of the villa. Outside, the night remains deep and absolute, a silent barrier that ensures the total security of this clandestine transcription, far from the watchful eyes of the authorities who fear the liberating power of human reason. You record each geometric corollary and each mechanical ratio with a steady and meticulous hand, watching the wet black ink dry into permanent, matte lines that bind his revolutionary insights to the fibre of the page forever. Galileo remains perfectly motionless in his high-backed chair, his sightless eyes directed toward the dark ceiling timbers as his mind continues to move effortlessly through the clean and beautiful laws that govern the silent stability of the physical world. The ink dries into a soft, permanent matte black line upon the page, locking the geometric proof of equal resistance into the very fibres of the heavy linen sheet. Galileo rests his hands flat against the cool walnut wood of the desk, his voice resuming its steady, unchanging monotone as he shifts his dictation toward the internal composition of solid matter itself. He explains that to fully understand why materials resist being pulled apart or broken by heavy loads, a philosopher must look beyond the visible surface of things and contemplate the hidden glue that binds the smallest particles of nature together. His voice remains flat and entirely serene, a comforting stream of sound that shows no sign of weariness as he introduces the concept of the resistance of the vacuum, a principle that operates on a scale far beneath the perception of the human eye. He instructs you to take a completely fresh sheet of parchment from the bundle, its untouched surface appearing pale and slightly textured under the warm yellow glow of the single beeswax candle. You slide the new page into position before you, feeling the slight weight of the fine fibres between your fingers, and dip the tip of your goose quill into the deep brass inkwell. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen returning to the page fills the small room once more, acting as a gentle anchor that focuses your entire mind on the physical act of writing. The master explains that when two polished surfaces of stone or metal are pressed tightly together, they adhere to one another with an immense force that resists separation, a phenomenon caused entirely by the absolute exclusion of air and the natural abhorrence that nature has for a vacuum. He dictates that this same hidden force operates within the tiny, invisible spaces between the individual fibers of a wooden beam or the crystalline grains of a forged iron bar, holding them together in a silent collective embrace that resists the destructive pull of external weights. You write down his words with a slow and steady hand, watching the thick black ink flow smoothly from the feather tip onto the pale paper, creating neat lines of text that dry slowly under the gentle warmth of the brazier. The comforting scent of old leather volumes and melting wax remains dense around the desk, providing a deep sense of security that shields you entirely from the modern rush of time and the hostile world outside these shuttered windows. Galileo explains that while this resistance of the vacuum is not the only force that holds the physical world together, it provides a precise, quantifiable baseline that allows science to measure the cohesive strength of solid bodies with mathematical certainty. Your pen follows his unhurried rhythm without a single pause, filling the new sheet with the profound and orderly laws that govern the silent stability of matter. The description of the invisible vacuum forces settles into the texture of the linen paper, establishing a microscopic foundation for the grand macroscopic structures you recorded on the previous sheets. Galileo allows his head to tilt slightly to the sotted, his sightless eyes remaining closed as he listens to the distant, lonely call of a winter owl echoing across the dark valleys of Arcatri. The absolute stillness of the villa returns for a brief moment, a profound and heavy silence that only serves to emphasize the complete isolation of this small room from the turbulent currents of 17th century history. The master breaks the quietude with a calm, unhurried breath, his voice returning to that flat, comforting monotone that has guided your hand through so many hours of continuous transcription. He instructs you to begin a new section on the parchment, shifting his analysis from the simple cohesion of uniform solids to the complex behavior of composite materials, specifically focusing on how different substances interact when they are bound together to resist a single mechanical force. He asks you to write down that when a builder joins a beam of tough oak wood with a plate of forged iron, the resulting compound structure does not simply possess the combined strength of the two individual parts, but behaves according to a completely new set of geometric and material proportions. You dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the dark brass well, feeling the familiar friction of the metal rim against the feather before bringing it back to the rough surface of the current sheet. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper forms a soothing rhythm that drives away any remaining mental fatigue, keeping you fully anchored in the peaceful progress of the manuscript. Galileo details how the iron plate, possessing a much higher resistance to tension, must be placed at the exact zone of maximum stretching along the bottom of the span, while the thick oak timber handles the massive compressive forces that push together along the top edge. He delivers these practical architectural insights with the same serene philosophical detachment that he applied to the trajectories of the planets, showing that the smallest workshop details are governed by the same elegant geometry that rules the highest heavens. The warm scent of the melting beeswax continues to rise from the candle flame, filling the narrow space around the walnut table with a reassuring and grounding aroma that shields you completely from the damp winter chill. Outside, the papal guards continue their slow, rhythmic patrol along the gravel paths, completely unaware that the dense lines of text drying upon your desk are systematically transforming the practical arts of construction into a precise universal science. You record each structural law, each material ratio, and each geometric corollary with an unwavering and meticulous hand, fully immersed in the slow and steady river of mathematical prose that flows from the master's mind onto the permanent archive of the page. The detailed analysis of composite structures sinks deeply into the grain of the parchment, leaving a permanent record of absolute structural logic beneath the soft golden glow of the single beeswax candle. Galileo allows his sightless eyes to rest in the comfortable shadows of the room, his breathing maintaining that slow and rhythmic cadence that has become the steady metronome of your late-night labor. He moves his dictation from the static combinations of wood and iron to the fluid dynamics of solid structures when they are submerged in water, introducing a beautiful convergence between his new science of material strength and the ancient laws of hydrostatics. His voice remains a flat, unwavering monotone, a comforting stream of sound that drives away the cold winter night with the pure warmth of mathematical clarity. He instructs you to write down that when a heavy timber or a solid stone pillar is placed into a body of water, its apparent weight is instantly reduced by an amount exactly equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces, a principle that alters the entire calculation of its internal breaking stress. You dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the dark brass well, the small click of the feather against the metal base signaling the start of a fresh paragraph of text. Scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper becomes a soothing anchor that quietens your thoughts, keeping your mind entirely focused on the physical act of transcription. The master explains that because of this natural buoyancy, a stone arch submerged at the base of a harbour wall experiences significantly less downward pressure than a similar arch standing in the open air, allowing ancient engineers to build massive underwater foundations that would otherwise fracture under their own immense bulk. He dictates this physical law with an absolute, unhurried precision, using clear geometric ratios to demonstrate how the density of the surrounding medium must be factored into every architectural design. The comforting scent of the raw beeswax blends with the sharp, metallic aroma of the drying black ink, creating a protective sanctuary of absolute security within the dark stone walls of the villa. Outside the heavy oak shutters, the cold wind continues to brush across the hills of Arcatri, a distant and lonely sound that only serves to make the quiet progress of the manuscript feel more precious and permanent. Galileo sits entirely motionless in his high-backed chair, his pale hands resting lightly upon his knees, as his mind effortlessly guides your pen through the intricate intersections of weight, volume, and material resistance. You record each specific dimension, each hydrostatic ratio, and each mechanical law with a steady and unwavering hand, completely immersed in the slow, monumental flow of 17th century mechanics that ensures the survival of his vision for generations to come. The hydrostatic equations settle smoothly into the pale grain of the linen page, creating a visual testament to the elegant unity of nature's laws under the soft and comforting glow of the beeswax candle. Galileo shifts his mind from the behavior of submerged pillars to the internal forces that govern the fracturing of hollow cylinders when they are subjected to external crushing pressures, a problem that directly impacts the design of deep water conduits and the defensive architecture of subterranean stone vaults. His voice continues in that flat, comforting monotone, a steady and soothing cadence that makes the most intricate mechanical problems feel as regular and predictable as the motion of the stars. He instructs you to write down that a hollow tube of stone or brick, when compressed from the outside by a uniform force, resists breaking through a beautiful geometric principle known as the arch effect, where the external pressure is distributed equally along the circumference and directed inward toward the adjacent blocks. You dip your goose quill into the deep brass inkwell, feeling the familiar friction of the feather tip against the metal base before bringing it back to the rough surface of the current parchment sheet. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular sound of the pen writing down these structural relationships forms a beautiful, repetitive pattern that keeps your mind entirely centered on the quiet physics of the page. Galileo details how this circular resistance is mathematically identical to the support provided by a vertical stone arch in a grand cathedral, showing that the same laws of leverage operate whether the force pushes downward from the sky or inward from the surrounding earth. You record every single parameter, every structural ratio, and every geometric equation with a steady, unhurried hand, watching the wet black ink slowly under the gentle golden light of the candle. The rich aroma of the ink mixes with the warm scent of the melting wax, creating a protective cocoon of safety around the wooden desk that shields you from the watchful eyes of the guards pacing in the dark courtyard outside. The master explains that if the circularity of the tube is even slightly imperfect, the uniform distribution of the force collapses instantly, causing the external pressure to concentrate at a single weak point until the material fractures inward with catastrophic speed. He delivers this profound structural warning with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who has long since ceased to care about the opinions of the world, focusing entirely on the eternal truths of geometry that govern the silent stability of all matter. The geometric warning concerning the distortion of the tube sinks into the parchment, a sharp lesson in precision fixed forever onto the linen page by the steady progress of your hand. Galileo remains perfectly motionless, his head resting slightly back against the carved wood of his chair, his posture radiating a deep, philosophical calm that fills the quiet laboratory with a profound sense of security. He directs your attention next to the absolute limits of tension that a single vertical rod of material can endure before its internal bonds are torn completely asunder, a physical threshold known as the absolute tensile strength. His voice remains a flat, soothing monotone, a slow and predictable stream of language that completely insulates your mind from the bitter winter dampness creeping through the thick stone walls of the villa. He instructs you to write down that when a heavy weight is suspended from a vertical cable made of hemp fibers or forged iron wires, the braking stress is distributed uniformly across every single point along its entire length, unlike the cantilever beam which experiences its maximum load only at the fixed base. You dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the dark brass well, feeling the familiar weight of the metal rim against your fingers before bringing the feather back to the rough surface of the current sheet. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and rhythmic sound of the pen tracking across the paper forms a comforting pattern that drives away any remaining modern distractions, leaving you completely immersed in the peaceful mechanics of the 17th century. The master details how the maximum length a cord can attain before breaking under the immense load of its own weight is completely independent of its thickness, because thickening the cable increases its total weight in the exact same proportion as its cross-sectional area. He dictates this elegant mathematical relationship with an absolute unhurried precision, using clear ratios to demonstrate that an iron wire a mile long will snap at its top anchor for the exact same reason as an iron rod of giant proportions. The warm scent of the melting beeswax rises gently around the walnut desk, blending with the deep metallic aroma of the drying ink to create a protective sanctuary of absolute knowledge. Outside, the cold wind continues its distant rustle through the dark olive trees of Arcatri, a lonely sound that only serves to make the quiet safety of this hidden room feel more precious and permanent. You watch the wet black ink dry into crisp, matte lines that capture the foundational principles of structural tension, recording each parameter with an unwavering and meticulous hand that ensures the total preservation of his final science. The elegant mathematical proof of tensile limits settles firmly into the pale grain of the linen sheet, marking another complete triumph of human reason over the mysteries of the physical world. Galileo allows his blind eyes to lift slightly toward the dark wooden beams above, his breath coming in a slow and unhurried rhythm that signals a major transition in his grand philosophical discourse. He explains that you have now successfully recorded the foundational laws governing both the motion of projectiles and the silent resistance of solid bodies, the two pillars of his new science. His voice remains a flat, soothing monotone, a steady and predictable wave of sound that wraps around the walnut table like a protective blanket against the cold winter night. He instructs you to prepare a fresh page of parchment from the remaining bundle, for his mind is now ready to look at how these dual principles combine to explain the grandest and most beautiful phenomenon of nature, the universal law of musical harmony and the vibration of chords. You slide the clean linen sheet into position before you, feeling its crisp and slightly cool texture beneath your fingertips, and dip the goose quill deep into the dark brass inkwell. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and comforting sound of the pen returning to the paper becomes a familiar anchor that completely quietens your thoughts, driving away any remaining modern anxieties. The master begins this new section by explaining that sound is not an empty phantom that drifts through the air without substance, but is itself a series of rapid physical impacts caused by the physical vibration of a solid body striking the surrounding atmosphere. He asks you to write down that when a taut string of an instrument is plucked by a musician's hand, it does not move haphazardly, but sweeps back and forth in a sequence of miniature parabolic curves that are governed by the exact same geometry of acceleration you recorded hours ago. You write down each sentence with a slow and meticulous hand, watching the wet black ink dry into permanent, matte lines under the gentle golden light of the beeswax candle. The rich aroma of the ink mixes with the warm scent of the melting wax, creating a small sanctuary of absolute security within the thick stone walls of the villa, entirely insulated from the hostile world outside these heavy oak shutters. Galileo details how the pitch of the musical note is determined solely by the frequency of these rapid vibrations, a beautiful physical truth that reduces the artistic mysteries of music to a matter of clean, cold mathematical proportion. Your pen follows his unhurried dictation without a single pause, filling the new sheet with the orderly laws that bind the sweet harmony of sound to the eternal rules of mechanics. The concept of musical pitch reducing to clean mathematical frequency dries upon the linen page, creating a visual harmony that mirrors the audible order of a finely tuned instrument. Galileo remains perfectly motionless in his high-backed oak chair, his sightless eyes closed as if he is listening to the faint internal resonance of the universe itself. His voice continues in that flat, comforting monotone, a steady and soothing cadence that fills the quiet space between the thick stone walls like a gentle, unhurried river. He instructs you to begin a new paragraph to explore the specific physical properties that determine the speed of these musical vibrations, introducing a threefold relationship that governs every stringed instrument from the humble lute to the grand harpsichord. He asks you to write down that the frequency of a vibrating chord is inversely proportional to its length, meaning that a string exactly half as long as another will complete its vibrations twice as fast, producing a perfect musical octave that delights the human ear. You dip your goose quill deep into the dark brass inkwell, feeling the familiar friction of the feather tip against the metal base before bringing it back to the rough surface of the parchment page. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular sound of the pen writing down these acoustic laws forms a beautiful repetitive pattern that keeps your mind entirely centered on the quiet physics of the page. Galileo details how the thickness and the material tension of the wire must also be factored into this elegant equation, explaining that the frequency changes in a direct proportion to the square root of the stretching weight applied to its end. You record every single parameter, every structural ratio, and every geometric equation with a steady, unhurried hand, watching the wet black ink dry slowly under the gentle golden light of the beeswax candle. The rich aroma of the ink mixes with the warm scent of the melting wax, creating a protective cocoon of safety around the wooden desk that shields you from the watchful eyes of the guards pacing in the dark courtyard outside. The master explains that when two strings are plucked at the exact same time, their individual sound waves travel through the air like the concentric ripples on a quiet pond, either blending together in a smooth and pleasing consonance or clashing in a harsh dissonance based entirely on the simple numerical ratios of their vibrations. He delivers this profound insight into the nature of beauty with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who sees pure geometry operating within the sweet air of a musical performance just as clearly as in the heavy stone foundations of a fortress wall. The mathematical foundation of musical consonance and dissonance settles permanently into the fibers of the heavy linen paper, its neat black script forming a quiet testament to the underlying geometry of human pleasure under the gentle golden light of the beeswax candle. Galileo allows his hands to rest motionless upon the dark walnut surface of the desk, his body remaining perfectly still within the high-backed oak chair as his mind prepares to venture even deeper into the mechanical secrets of wave propagation and resonance. His voice resumes its steady, flat monotone, a comforting and unwavering stream of language that completely insulates the small laboratory from the cold creeping dampness of the Tuscan night. He instructs you to take a completely fresh sheet of parchment from the bundle, its untouched surface appearing cool and slightly textured under the soft yellow glow of the flame. You slide the new page into position before you, feeling the slight weight of the fine fibers between your fingers, and dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the deep brass inkwell, ensuring the split feather is fully coated with the rich iron liquid. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen returning to the page fills the quiet room once more, acting as a gentle anchor that focuses your entire mind on the physical act of writing, driving away any remaining modern anxieties. The master begins this extended discourse by exploring the phenomenon of sympathetic resonance, explaining that if two stringed instruments are tuned to the exact same pitch and placed near one another, plucking a single wire on the first lute will cause the corresponding wire on the second lute to tremble and sing in perfect unison without ever being touched by human hands. He dictates in a calm, neutral monotone that this invisible communication is not the result of magical sympathy or occult forces, as the old schoolmen claimed, but is caused entirely by the physical movement of the air itself, which carries the rapid percussions from the first string to strike against the second with a precise, repetitive frequency that matches its own natural period of motion. You write down his words with a slow and steady hand, watching the thick black ink flow smoothly from the feather tip onto the pale paper, creating dense lines of text that dry slowly under the gentle warmth of the nearby charcoal brazier. The comforting scent of old leather volumes, dry parchment, and melting wax remains dense around the wooden desk, providing a deep sense of security that shields you entirely from the modern rush of time and the hostile world outside these heavy oak shutters. Galileo explains that this mechanical interaction can be calculated with absolute geometric precision by analyzing the momentum of the tiny air particles as they travel across the room, demonstrating that each individual wave delivers a miniature impulse that gradually accumulates until the resting string is forced to move in perfect synchronization. He guides your hand to detail a specific mathematical ratio showing how this sympathetic vibration decreases in intensity as the physical distance between the instruments increases, a decay that follows the exact inverse square law that governs the dissipation of light from a candle flame or the gravitational pull of a distant planet. The master delivers this profound insight with a complete lack of dramatic emphasis, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who has long since ceased to care about the praise of academies or the threats of inquisitors, focusing his remaining energy entirely on the eternal and unalterable laws of nature. Outside, the distant wind continues to brush softly across the dark olive groves of Arcatri, a cold and indifferent sound that only serves to make the quiet safety of this hidden sanctuary feel more precious and permanent. You record each specific parameter, each mechanical ratio, and each geometric corollary with an unwavering and meticulous hand fully immersed in the slow, monumental river of 17th century science that flows effortlessly from the master's mind onto the permanent archive of the page. Your pen moves with a steady, unhurried cadence, filling the broad margins of the linen sheet with a beautiful, dense script that ensures the total survival of his vision, long after the deep shadows of the winter night have faded away into the light of the morning. The complex mathematical ratios of wave dissipation settle completely into the grain of the heavy linen sheet, adding another layer of dense, unyielding logic to the growing manuscript under the soft and comforting glow of the beeswax candle. Galileo allows his chin to sink slightly toward his chest, his weathered palms resting perfectly flat against the smooth walnut wood of the desk, his unseeing eyes closed as his mind seamlessly shifts into the next extended segment of his acoustic treatise. His voice remains a flat, unwavering monotone, a steady and soothing cadence that fills the quiet room like a continuous stream of warm water, completely dissolving the bitter winter chill that creeps silently through the thick stone walls of the villa. He instructs you to prepare another fresh page of parchment from the bundle, ensuring that your margins remain wide and clear to accommodate the intricate geometric proofs that will define the exact physical behavior of vibrating surfaces and the creation of standing waves. You slide the new page into position before you, feeling the clean, textured weight of the fibers between your fingers, and dip the tip of your goose quill deep into the brass inkwell, the slight click of the feather against the metal rim signaling a renewed focus. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper forms a beautiful, rhythmic pattern that quietens your mind, keeping you fully anchored in the peaceful progress of the transcription, entirely insulated from the anxieties of the modern world outside. The master begins this detailed analysis by discussing an experiment he performed during his youth, involving a wide brass plate covered with a fine layer of dry sand, which was set into vibration by drawing a long bowstring sharply across its sharp outer edge. He dictates in an unhurried, neutral monotone that as the metal begins to sing with a high resonant tone, the sand does not scatter haphazardly across the surface, but instantly organizes itself into a series of beautiful geometric lines and concentric rings, leaving certain areas of the plate entirely bare while gathering in dense piles along specific mathematical boundaries. You write down his words with a slow and steady hand, watching the thick black ink flow smoothly from the feather tip onto the pale paper, creating neat, compressed lines of text that dry slowly under the gentle warmth of the nearby charcoal brazier. The comforting scent of old leather volumes, melting beeswax, and the metallic aroma of the drying ink remains dense around the table, providing a deep sense of security that shields you entirely from the passage of hours and the hostile world outside these heavy oak shutters. Galileo explains that these structural patterns, which modern naturalists often view as a mystery of nature, are actually the direct visual representation of nodal lines, where the opposing waves travelling through the metal plate interfere with one another so perfectly that these specific areas remain entirely motionless amidst the surrounding vibration. He guides your hand to draw a clear diagram on the lower half of the parchment, showing a square plane divided into symmetrical quadrants by fine, dotted lines that indicate the resting zones where the sand accumulates, transforming the invisible mechanics of sound into a visible blueprint of absolute geometric order. The master details how the number of these nodal lines increases in a direct mathematical proportion to the frequency of the musical pitch, proving that higher notes create smaller, more complex geometric divisions within the solid material than lower, deeper tones. He delivers this profound structural insight with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who sees the same elegant geometry operating within a vibrating plate of brass as in the immense orbital paths of the celestial bodies. Outside, beyond the heavy wooden shutters, the papal guards continue their slow, unhurried watch in the dark courtyard, completely unaware that the dense lines of text drying upon your desk are quietly dismantling the ancient monopoly on knowledge that their masters have guarded for centuries. You record each parameters, each mechanical ratio, and each geometric corollary with an unwavering and meticulous hand, fully immersed in the slow and steady river of 17th century mechanics that flows from the master's mind onto the permanent archive of the page, building a beautiful and enduring monument to the power of human reason. The geometric blueprint of the sand patterns on the vibrating metal plate settles into the grain of the parchment, a silent arrangement of absolute order recorded under the soft, comforting glow of the single beeswax candle. Galileo sits perfectly motionless in his high-backed oak chair, his long arms resting flat against the dark walnut of the desk, as he prepares to transition his acoustic discourse from the behavior of solid plates to the mechanics of fluid vibrations, specifically focusing on the creation of waves inside a column of air, such as an organ pipe or a common wooden flute. His voice remains a flat, soothing monotone, carrying the deep and grounded weight of an ancient thinker who sees the same mathematical rules operating in the invisible movements of the wind as in the heavy stones of a cathedral arch. He instructs you to take another fresh sheet of heavy linen paper from the bundle, its untouched surface appearing pale and slightly textured under the gentle yellow light of the flame. You slide the new page into position before you, feeling the slight weight of the fine fibres between your fingers, and dip the goose quill into the deep brass inkwell, the black liquid catching the golden reflection of the candle flame before you return the tip to the paper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the paper forms a comforting rhythm that completely quietens your mind, keeping you fully anchored in the peaceful progress of the manuscript, entirely insulated from the rush of the modern world. The master details how the pitch of an organ pipe is determined not by the material of the pipe itself, whether it be made of lead, tin, or seasoned wood, but solely by the physical length of the air column contained within its hollow center. He explains that when air is forced into the mouth of the pipe, it creates a series of rapid, periodic compressions and expansions that travel up and down the length of the cylinder, reflecting off the open end to form a continuous standing wave that vibrates at a specific, predictable frequency. You write down his words with a slow and meticulous hand, watching the wet black ink flow smoothly from the feather tip onto the pale paper, creating dense lines of text that dry slowly under the gentle warmth of the charcoal brazier. The warm scent of the melting beeswax fills the small pocket of air around the table, combining with the dry heat of the fire to keep the bitter winter chill from stiffening your knuckles as you write. Galileo continues his steady dictation without a single pause, explaining that an open organ pipe produces a note whose wavelength is exactly twice the physical length of the tube, while a pipe that is closed at one end forces the air column to vibrate at a frequency 4 times its length, producing a note that is a full musical octave lower than its open counterpart. He instructs you to record the geometric proof of this acoustic relationship, showing how nature uses the boundaries of the solid container to shape the velocity of the air, a beautiful mechanical design that human instrument makers must learn to calculate precisely if they wish to achieve perfect temperament. You record each specific dimension, each mechanical ratio, and each structural law with an unwavering and meticulous hand, fully immersed in the slow and steady river of 17th century science that flows from the master's mind onto the permanent archive of the page. Outside, the night remains deep and absolute, a protective barrier of shadow that ensures the absolute security of this late-night transcription, far from the watchful eyes of the authorities who fear the liberating power of human reason. Your pen follows his unhurried rhythm without a single deviation, filling the broad margins of the linen sheet with a beautiful, dense script that ensures the total preservation of his final science long after the deep shadows of the winter night have faded away into the light of the morning. The elegant geometric proof of the standing waves within the organ pipe settles into the grain of the parchment, its rich black characters forming a dense, unyielding grid of absolute structural logic under the soft, comforting glow of the single beeswax candle. Galileo allows his sightless eyes to drift upward toward the dark ceiling timbers, his face remaining completely serene, his posture in the high-backed oak chair reflecting a profound, timeless calm that fills the quiet laboratory with an overwhelming sense of safety and permanent order. He moves his dictation seamlessly from the behavior of single air columns to the complex phenomenon of acoustic beats, which occurs when two musical notes of slightly different frequencies are sounded together, creating a slow, rhythmic pulsing that can be felt physically through the air. His voice continues in that flat, comforting monotone, a steady and predictable stream of sound that serves as an absolute barrier against the cold winter dampness creeping through the thick stone walls of the villa. He instructs you to take another fresh sheet of heavy linen paper from the bundle, its untouched surface appearing pale and slightly textured under the gentle yellow light of the flame. You slide the new page into position before you, feeling the slight weight of the fine fibers between your fingertips, and dip the goose quill deep into the dark brass inkwell, feeling the familiar friction of the feather tip against the metal rim before bringing it back to the rough surface of the parchment. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and rhythmic sound of the pen tracking across the paper becomes a soothing anchor that quietens your thoughts, driving away any remaining modern anxieties and keeping your mind entirely centered on the physical progress of the text. The master explains that when two notes are out of tune by only a few vibrations per second, their sound waves travel through the room like two independent sets of ripples on the surface of a quiet pond, sometimes reinforcing one another when their peaks coincide, and sometimes cancelling one another out when a peak meets a trough. He dictates in an unhurried, neutral monotone that this alternating reinforcement and interference creates a regular rise and fall in the intensity of the sound, a mechanical pattern whose frequency is precisely equal to the mathematical difference between the two original notes. You write down his words with a slow and steady hand, watching the thick black ink flow smoothly from the feather tip onto the pale paper, creating dense lines of text that dry slowly under the gentle warmth of the nearby charcoal brazier. The comforting scent of old leather volumes, dry parchment, and melting wax remains dense around the wooden desk, providing a deep sense of security that shields you entirely from the passage of hours and the hostile world outside these heavy oak shutters. Galileo details how an experienced musician uses these acoustic beats to tune a grand harpsichord with absolute mathematical certainty, turning the pins until the slow pulsing slows down, stretches out, and finally disappears entirely, signaling that the two strings have achieved a state of perfect geometric unison. He guides your hand to draw a clear diagram on the lower half of the page, showing two parallel wavy lines whose crests gradually drift into alignment and then away again, translating the complex auditory experience of dissonance into a beautiful, scannable blueprint of spatial geometry. The master delivers this profound insight with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who sees the same elegant geometry operating within the delicate tuning of an instrument as in the immense, silent trajectories of the planets. Outside, the distant wind continues to brush softly across the dark olive groves of Arcatri, a cold and indifferent sound that only serves to make the quiet safety of this hidden sanctuary feel more precious and permanent. You record each specific dimension, each mechanical ratio, and each structural law with an unwavering and meticulous hand, fully immersed in the slow and steady river of 17th century science that flows from the master's mind onto the permanent archive of the page, building an enduring monument to the liberating power of human reason. The parallel wavy lines representing the acoustic interference of beats to a permanent matte finish upon the heavy linen sheet, transforming a transient sensation of musical discord into a timeless record of spatial geometry under the soft, comforting glow of the beeswax candle. Galileo allows another long, peaceful pause to settle over the dark room, his breath moving with that slow and regular cadence that has become the steady metronome of your late-night labor. He sits perfectly straight within the high-backed oak chair, his blind eyes closed as his mind seamlessly prepares to move his grand mechanical discourse from the behavior of vibrating columns of air to the profound physics of the human ear itself. His voice resumes its steady, flat monotone, a comforting and unwavering stream of language that completely insulates the small laboratory from the cold, creeping dampness of the Tuscan night, keeping you fully anchored in the peaceful progress of the manuscript. He instructs you to take a completely fresh sheet of parchment from the bundle, its untouched surface appearing pale and slightly cool under your fingertips as you slide it into position on the dark walnut table. You pick up your goose quill, feeling the familiar weight of the feather, and dip the split tip deep into the dark brass inkwell, ensuring it is fully coated with the rich iron liquid before returning it to the page. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The regular and predictable sound of the pen tracking across the textured paper fills the quiet room once more, acting as a gentle anchor that drives away any remaining modern anxieties and leaves your mind entirely focused on the slow, majestic flow of 17th century mechanics. The master begins this extended analysis by explaining that the human ear is not a mysterious, spiritual vessel that captures sound through some magical or occult property, as the old Aristotelian schoolmen believed, but is itself a highly refined mechanical instrument designed to respond precisely to the physical impact of vibrating air particles. He dictates in a calm, neutral monotone that the thin membrane located deep within the auditory canal, known to modern anatomists as the tympanum or drum, acts exactly like the taut parchment skin of a military drum, vibrating back and forth in perfect synchronization with the external wave frequencies that strike against its outer surface. You write down his words with a slow and steady hand, watching the thick black ink flow smoothly from the feather tip onto the pale paper, creating dense lines of text that dry slowly under the gentle warmth of the nearby charcoal brazier. The comforting scent of old leather volumes, dry parchment, and melting wax remains dense around the wooden desk, providing a deep sense of security that shields you entirely from the passage of hours and the hostile world outside these heavy oak shutters. Galileo details how this mechanical vibration is transmitted from the thin membrane through a sequence of 3 tiny, delicate bones whose lever arms are arranged according to the exact same laws of proportion and mechanical advantage that you recorded hours ago when analyzing the grand stone arches and structural beams of fortresses. He guides your hand to describe how these miniature bone levers amplify the physical force of the airwaves, demonstrating that nature uses the exact same geometry to design the internal mechanism of human hearing as it does to govern the balance of a massive balance scale or the leverage of a heavy iron crowbar. The master delivers this profound insight with a complete lack of drama, using the quiet, neutral language of an old philosopher who has long since ceased to care about the praise of academies or the threats of inquisitors, focusing entirely on the eternal truths of geometry that govern the silent stability and functionality of all matter. Outside, beyond the heavy wooden shutters, the papal guards continue their slow, unhurried watch in the dark courtyard, completely unaware that the dense lines of text drying upon your desk are quietly dismantling the ancient monopoly on knowledge that their masters have guarded for centuries. You record each specific parameter, each mechanical ratio, and each structural law with an unwavering and meticulous hand, fully immersed in the slow and steady river of 17th century science that flows from the master's mind onto the permanent archive of the page, building a beautiful and enduring monument to the power of human reason. Your pen moves with an unhurried, rhythmic cadence, filling the broad margins of the linen sheet with a dense, beautiful script that ensures the total preservation of his final science long after the deep shadows of the winter night have faded away into the light of the morning. The detailed description of the human ear as a mechanical marvel of leverage and proportion settles into the parchment, the final drop of rich black ink absorbing slowly into the pale, textured fibers of the heavy linen sheet. Galileo allows his hands to lift gently from the walnut table, resting them upon his knees as he leans his head back against the carved oak of his chair, letting out a long, quiet breath that signals the true completion of his grand philosophical labor. His voice drops into a flat, soothing monotone that feels softer now, a gentle and comforting murmur that wraps around the small laboratory like the first pale light of dawn that is just beginning to filter through the cracks of the heavy wooden shutters. He instructs you to lay down your goose quill for the very last time, its split feather tip resting peacefully against the brass rim of the deep inkwell, while the regular sound of scratch, scratch fades into a deep, absolute and protective silence. You rub your tired fingers, feeling the cool air of the room soothing your wrists, while the comforting aroma of the melting beeswax and old leather volumes remains thick and warm around the desk, shielding you entirely from the modern rush of time and any remaining anxieties. The master tells you that the two new sciences, the mechanics of solid structures and the laws of accelerated motion, are now safely bound to the page, transformed from transient thoughts into an unyielding, permanent archive of human reason that no inquisitor can ever erase or destroy. He delivers this final, monumental truth with a complete lack of drama, his serene posture reflecting a profound, philosophical peace that drives away all shadows, leaving your mind perfectly still and resting in the beautiful, eternal harmony of the universe. Outside, the distant wind among the olive trees of Arcatri finally dies away as the dark winter night begins to soften, leaving the completed manuscript lying secure upon the table, a silent monument to the liberating power of human reason that will endure for centuries to come. The final sheet of heavy linen parchment is placed neatly atop the thick stack of documents resting in the center of the walnut desk, forming a solid, uniform block under the dying golden glow of the beeswax candle. Galileo sits perfectly still in the deep shadows of the room, his weathered hands resting quietly on his lap, his serene face reflecting an absolute, philosophical peace after a long night of continuous intellectual labor. His voice drops into a soft, fading whisper, a gentle and comforting murmur that wraps around the small laboratory like the cool air of dawn beginning to filter through the heavy oak shutters, signaling that the grand work is finally complete. He instructs you to blow out the flickering flame, close the heavy brass inkwell, and allow your mind to rest after this monumental journey through the eternal and unalterable laws of motion, tension, and structural harmony. The rich aroma of the melting wax and the sharp metallic scent of the drying ink slowly dissipate into the room, leaving behind the clean, crisp freshness of the early morning creeping over the dark hills of Arcatry. The regular repetitive sound of scratch, scratch, scratch has completely faded into a profound protective silence, isolating the small room from the modern rush of time and any remaining anxieties. The master's final treatise, The Two New Sciences, is now safely bound to the fibre of the page, transformed from transient thoughts within the mind of a blind exiled philosopher into an unyielding, permanent archive of human reason that no inquisitor can ever destroy. Outside the heavy wooden shutters, the slow, rhythmic footsteps of the papal guards grow distant and finally vanish, replaced by the early chirping of birds among the dark branches of the ancient olive trees. The deep shadows of the winter night slowly soften as the first pale light of dawn begins to touch the horizon of Florence, illuminating the completed manuscript lying secure upon the table, a silent, immortal monument to the liberating power of human reason that will endure for centuries to come. This is a work of creative historical narrative, constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined to provide an immersive auditory experience. This content was developed with the assistance of advanced AI tools and has been meticulously reviewed, verified, and edited by the editorial team at Whispers of Centuries. All rights reserved. Until next time, listen closely to the whispers of the past, because you never know what timeless wisdom might quietly find its way into your night.